I was at a family dinner when two Colombians burst in, dragging my daughter. Was it worth fighting our cartels, old man? My daughter thrashed, screaming for help. At that moment, I saw my son-in-law smiling and signaling them. The traitorous sellout just didn't expect that. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this and comment the city you're watching from. My name is Gerald, and for 32 years, I believed I was fighting the good fight. As a federal prosecutor, I'd spent decades dismantling drug cartels, money laundering operations, and corruption networks that poisoned our communities. I thought I was making a difference. I thought I was protecting innocent people. What I never imagined was that the greatest threat to my family would walk through our front door with a bouquet of roses and a charming smile. It was a crisp October evening, and Stella had insisted we have dinner at home instead of going out. She'd been glowing lately, happier than I'd seen her in years, all because of Marcus. My son-in-law had been part of our family for 18 months now, and I had to admit, he seemed perfect for my daughter. Too perfect, maybe. But what father doesn't think that about the man who steals his little girl's heart? Marcus Romano had appeared in Stella's life during one of her lowest points. She'd just ended a relationship with a guy who'd cheated on her, and she was questioning everything about her choices in men. Then Marcus showed up at the coffee shop where she worked part-time while finishing her master's degree in social work. He was charming, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in her dreams of helping troubled kids. I remember the first time she brought him home. He was well-dressed, polite, and asked thoughtful questions about my work without seeming nosy. He even brought my wife Eleanor's favorite wine, a detail that impressed her immensely. When he talked about his family back in Miami, his voice carried just the right amount of emotion when he mentioned losing his parents in a car accident. Everything about him felt authentic. "Dad, isn't Marcus wonderful?" Stella had whispered to me that first night as we cleared dishes. Her eyes sparkled with a happiness I hadn't seen since she was a teenager. How could I tell her that something felt off, that his answers were too practiced, his stories too convenient? But tonight, as we sat around the dining room table, I pushed those nagging doubts aside. Stella had cooked Marcus's favorite meal, and Eleanor had spent the afternoon making her famous apple pie. The conversation flowed easily, touching on Marcus's new promotion at the import-export company where he worked, Stella's progress on her thesis, and our plans for Thanksgiving. "I'm thinking of proposing soon," Marcus had said earlier that week, pulling me aside after dinner. "I love your daughter, Gerald. I want to spend my life making her happy." His handshake was firm, his eye contact steady. Every instinct I'd developed as a prosecutor told me he was lying, but my heart as a father wanted desperately to believe him. The doorbell rang just as Eleanor was serving dessert. We weren't expecting anyone, and it was nearly 9 o'clock. I started to get up, but Marcus was already on his feet. "I'll get it," he said, his hand briefly touching Stella's shoulder. Such a small gesture, but something in his tone made me look at him more carefully. There was a tension in his voice that hadn't been there moments before. "Actually, let me," I said, standing. "You're a guest here." Marcus sat back down, but I caught something in his expression, a flicker of annoyance maybe, or nervousness. "Of course, Gerald. Whatever you think is best." I walked to the front door, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. Through the peephole, I saw two men in dark clothing standing on my porch. They didn't look like neighbors or delivery drivers. One was tall and lean, with a scar running down his left cheek. The other was shorter but broader, with the kind of build that comes from serious gym time or serious violence. My blood ran cold. After 32 years prosecuting cartel cases, I recognized the look. These weren't random criminals or burglars. These were professionals, and they were here for a reason. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. My service weapon was locked in the safe upstairs, but by the time I could get to it, whatever was about to happen would be over. I needed to get Eleanor and Stella out of the house, but how could I do that without alerting whoever was outside? The doorbell rang again, longer this time, more insistent. "Gerald?" Eleanor called from the dining room. "Who is it?" Before I could answer, the sound of splintering wood filled the house. They weren't waiting for an invitation. The front door burst open with a violence that sent pictures rattling on the walls. The two men stormed in, and the shorter one was dragging someone with him. "Daddy!" Stella's voice cut through the chaos, but it wasn't coming from the dining room. It was coming from the hallway, from the man's grip. They had my daughter. My heart stopped. Stella was struggling against her captor, her hair disheveled, her dress torn at the shoulder. Her eyes were wide with terror, searching for me, begging me to save her. The sight of her fear sent a rage through me that I'd never experienced, not even during my darkest cases. "Gerald Martinez," the taller man said, his accent thick with Colombian inflection. "The famous prosecutor, the man who thinks he can destroy our families and walk away clean." I stepped into the living room, my hands raised, but my mind calculating. Eleanor was somewhere behind me, probably frozen in shock. Marcus was still in the dining room. Maybe he could call for help, get the police here before this got worse. "Let her go," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the terror clawing at my chest. "Your problem is with me, not with her." The man smiled, revealing gold teeth that glinted in the lamplight. "Oh, but Senor Gerald, you don't understand. When you destroy our families, we destroy yours. It's only fair, no?" Stella writhed in her captor's arms, trying to break free. "Dad, help me, please." "Was it worth it?" the tall man continued, taking a step closer. "All those years fighting our cartels, all those lives you ruined, was it worth your daughter's life?" That's when I saw him. Marcus appeared in the doorway between the living room and dining room, but he wasn't rushing to help. He wasn't calling 911 or looking for a weapon. He was standing there completely calm, and when his eyes met those of the tall Colombian, he smiled. Not a smile of relief or recognition. It was a smile of satisfaction, of a job well done. Marcus nodded slightly at the man holding my daughter, a subtle signal that made my blood freeze. My son-in-law, the man I'd welcomed into my home, the man my daughter loved, had just given the signal that sealed her fate. Everything I thought I knew about Marcus Romano shattered in that single moment, and I realized that the most dangerous enemy I'd ever faced had been sitting at my dinner table for 18 months, planning this exact moment. The smile on Marcus's face lasted only seconds, but it burned itself into my memory like a brand. In that instant, 32 years of prosecutorial instincts came flooding back, and I realized how blind I'd been. All those little details that had nagged at me, all those moments when something felt just slightly off about my son-in-law, suddenly clicked into place like pieces of a puzzle I'd been too emotionally invested to solve. Marcus had first approached Stella at Grind Coffee, the little shop near the university where she worked weekends. She'd told me the story a dozen times, how he'd ordered a complicated drink and then lingered to chat about the book she was reading. "He seemed so genuine, Dad," she'd said. "Not like those guys who just want to hook up. He actually listened." But now, watching him exchange that knowing look with my daughter's captors, I remembered something that should have been a red flag. The book Stella had been reading that day was The Prosecutor's Dilemma, a memoir by a federal attorney who'd specialized in cartel cases. What were the odds that a random guy would want to discuss that particular book with a young woman he'd just met? "You see, Gerald," the tall Colombian said, apparently enjoying the shock on my face, "Marcus here has been very helpful, very patient. 18 months is a long time to wait. But good information is worth the investment, no?" I looked at Marcus again, this time seeing him clearly for the first time since Stella had brought him home. The way he'd always steered conversations toward my work, asking seemingly innocent questions about cases I'd handled, procedures I'd used, people I'd worked with. I'd attributed it to natural curiosity about his future father-in-law's career. "How long have you known about my retirement party?" I asked Marcus directly, ignoring the weapons pointed at me. 2 months earlier, my colleagues had thrown me a surprise celebration at the federal courthouse. It had been a small gathering, just family and close work friends. Marcus had been there, of course, charming everyone with his interest in their stories. Marcus's expression shifted slightly, the mask slipping for just a moment. "Gerald, I don't know what you think is happening here, but cut the act," I said. The pieces were falling into place too quickly to deny. "Judge Morrison mentioned the Valdez case that night. You asked very specific questions about the money laundering charges. How did you know to ask about offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands? That detail was never made public. The judge had indeed mentioned the Valdez case, one of my biggest victories from 5 years ago. We'd dismantled a network that was washing nearly $50 million annually through shell companies. Marcus had listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that I'd assumed came from genuine interest. Now I realized he'd been conducting an interview, gathering intelligence. Stella stopped struggling against her captor and stared at Marcus. What is he talking about? Marcus, tell them to let me go. Tell them there's been a mistake. There is no mistake, mi amor, Marcus said, and his accent was different now. Subtle, but noticeable. The carefully neutral American pronunciation he'd maintained for 18 months was giving way to something else, something that carried the rhythm of Spanish as a first language. You son of a bitch, I whispered. How long have you been planning this? The shorter Colombian chuckled. Oh, Senor Gerald, you want to know how long? Marcus contacted us 3 years ago. He volunteered to get close to your family, said he could be patient, said he could make your daughter fall in love with him. Smart boy, very dedicated. 3 years. That meant Marcus had been planning this operation since before he'd ever met Stella. While she was struggling through her previous relationship, crying over some college boy who'd cheated on her, Marcus was already identifying her as a target. He'd probably researched her habits, her favorite places, her vulnerabilities. I thought about the early days of their relationship, how Marcus had seemed to appear at just the right moments in Stella's life. When she'd been overwhelmed by her thesis research, he'd shown up with coffee and offered to help her organize her notes. When she'd been stressed about money, he'd suggested the perfect part-time job at a boutique where, coincidentally, he knew the manager. Every kindness, every gesture of love had been calculated. The night you proposed, I said to Marcus, my voice hoarse with rage, you asked me about the Rodriguez case, that you were curious about how we'd tracked the money through legitimate businesses. That had been 6 months ago. Marcus had pulled me aside after dinner, ostensibly to ask for my blessing to marry Stella. During our conversation, he'd mentioned seeing a news article about old cases being reviewed and wondered about investigative techniques. I'd been so touched by his respect for my career that I'd shared more than I should have about ongoing investigations. He's been very thorough, the tall Colombian said. Names of informants, details about seized assets, locations of safe houses. Your son-in-law has been a goldmine of information. The safe houses. My blood went cold as I realized the implications. 3 months ago, 2 of our key witnesses in an ongoing cartel case had been murdered in what we thought was a random break-in at a supposedly secure location. Only a handful of people had known that address. The Morales family, I breathed. You killed them. Marcus shrugged, no longer bothering to maintain his facade. Necessary casualties. They should have minded their own business instead of talking to federal prosecutors. Stella made a choking sound, as if she'd been physically struck. The man she'd loved, the man she'd planned to marry, had just casually admitted to murdering a family of 4, including 2 young children who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. You're a monster, she whispered. I'm practical, Marcus replied. Your father has cost our organization hundreds of millions of dollars over the years. He's put dozens of our people in prison. Did you think there wouldn't be consequences? I studied his face, looking for any trace of the man who'd sat at my dinner table, who'd held my daughter's hand, who'd called me sir with apparent respect. There was nothing left of that performance now. This was the real Marcus Romano, if that was even his real name. What's your real name? I asked. Miguel Santos, he said. Son of Carlos Santos, who died in federal prison thanks to your prosecution of the Medellin connection case. Remember that one, Gerald? You were so proud when the judge gave him life without parole. Carlos Santos. I remembered the case vividly. Santos had been running fentanyl through port operations in Miami, killing hundreds of Americans with tainted drugs. During the trial, he'd sworn vengeance against everyone involved in his prosecution. I'd assumed it was the usual courtroom theater, the desperate threats of a man facing life behind bars. Your father was a killer, I said. He poisoned communities, destroyed families. My father was a businessman, Miguel replied coldly. And you destroyed my family, so now I destroy yours. The symmetry was sick but undeniable. While I'd been building my career prosecuting men like Carlos Santos, his son had been planning the perfect revenge, and he'd almost pulled it off. If not for this moment, this revelation, he might have married my daughter and spent years slowly bleeding information from our family. Stella was crying now, quiet sobs that broke my heart. She'd loved him completely, trusted him with her future, and now she was learning that every moment of their relationship had been a lie designed to hurt the people she cared about most. But as I looked at Miguel Santos, the man who'd pretended to be Marcus Romano, I realized something that gave me hope. He'd made one crucial mistake in his elaborate plan. He'd underestimated exactly how much a federal prosecutor learns to suspect everyone, even the people closest to home. The revelation that Marcus was actually Miguel Santos, son of a man I'd sent to die in federal prison, should have been the worst moment of my life. Instead, it was the moment I realized I'd been 3 steps ahead of him all along. As I watched Stella's world crumble, seeing the love of her life revealed as a calculating predator, I felt sick about what I'd allowed to happen to my daughter. But I also felt a grim satisfaction, knowing that Miguel's elaborate revenge plot was about to backfire spectacularly. "You want to know something interesting about your father?" I said to Miguel, keeping my voice conversational despite the weapons trained on me. Carlos Santos wasn't just running fentanyl through Miami ports. He was also skimming money from his own organization, planning to disappear with about $12 million in cartel funds. Miguel's confident expression flickered for just a moment. "You're lying." "Am I?" "Check the sealed evidence files from his case. We recovered financial records showing transfers to accounts in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands. Your father wasn't the loyal soldier you think he was. He was planning to betray his own people and run. The truth was more complicated than that. But Miguel didn't need to know the full story. Carlos Santos had indeed been stealing from the cartel, but we'd used that information to flip him, trying to get him to cooperate. He'd refused, choosing prison over betraying his associates, which had actually earned my grudging respect. But his son didn't need to know about his father's final moment of honor. "Shut up," Miguel snarled, but I could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. Good. Doubt was what I needed. "The real question," I continued, "is whether the people who sent you know about your father's theft. Because if they do, they're probably not planning to let you live long enough to enjoy your revenge." Stella was staring at me with confusion and terror. She didn't understand why I was antagonizing her captors instead of trying to negotiate her release. But Eleanor, God bless her, knew me well enough to recognize the tone in my voice. She was quietly moving toward the kitchen, probably hoping to find a way out or a weapon. "You think you're smart, don't you?" the tall Colombian said, standing there talking like you still have control. "But look around, Gerald. We have your daughter. We have your wife. You have nothing." That's when I smiled, and I saw Miguel's confidence waver again. Because the truth was, I'd suspected something was wrong with Marcus Romano for the past 4 months, ever since he'd asked that question about the Rodriguez case. No civilian should have known enough to ask about money laundering techniques with that level of specificity. "You're right about one thing," I said. "I don't have control. But then again, neither do you." The first sign that Miguel had underestimated me came when I pulled my phone from my pocket. The Colombian holding Stella immediately tensed, assuming I was going for a weapon, but I moved slowly, deliberately. "I've been recording this conversation," I said, holding up the device. "Voice activation started the moment you broke down my door. Everything you've said, every admission, every threat, it's all being uploaded to a secure server that the FBI will access if I don't check in every 12 hours. Miguel's face went pale. "You're bluffing." "Am I? You spent 18 months learning my habits, studying my work, researching my cases. Did you really think I wouldn't notice that my future son-in-law knew way too much about federal prosecution techniques? Did you think I wouldn't start investigating you?" The truth was even better than what I was telling them. 4 months ago, when Marcus had asked about the Rodriguez case, I'd contacted an old colleague at the Bureau. Agent Sarah Chen had run a background check on Marcus Romano and found what we call a perfect identity, a backstory that was just a little too clean, a little too convenient. Marcus Romano graduated from University of Miami with a business degree, I said, watching Miguel's expression grow more nervous. But here's the interesting part. The university has no record of anyone by that name in their system. The social security number traces back to a child who died in a car accident in 1998. The import-export company, where you supposedly work, it's a shell company registered in Delaware, with no actual business operations. Stella gasped. Even in her terror, she was beginning to understand the scope of the deception. The man she'd planned to marry, the man she'd brought into our family, didn't even exist. I've known who you really were for 2 months, I continued. Miguel Santos, age 28, born in Bogota, Colombia, entered the United States illegally in 2019. You've been using 3 different identities, and the FBI has been tracking all of them. This wasn't entirely true. I'd only confirmed his real identity 3 weeks ago, but Miguel didn't need to know that. What mattered was making him understand that his carefully planned operation had been compromised from almost the beginning. You want to know the really beautiful part? I said, stepping closer despite the weapons pointed at me. Every piece of information you think you've gathered from me over the past 18 months, most of it was deliberately false. Miguel's eyes widened. What? The safe house locations you passed along? We fed you the addresses of abandoned buildings, the informant names? Half of them were made up, and the other half were retired agents living in Florida. The money laundering techniques you asked about? Outdated methods we haven't used in 5 years. The Colombian holding Stella was looking increasingly uncomfortable. This wasn't going according to plan. They'd expected to find a helpless victim, not a prosecutor who'd been running a counterintelligence operation from his own dining room table. The Morales family murder, I said, my voice hardening. That was a real tragedy, but it wasn't caused by information you gathered. Those people died because we deliberately leaked their location as part of a larger operation to identify the cartel's sources inside law enforcement. We knew someone would try to kill them, and we were hoping to catch the leak. This was a lie, but a necessary one. The Morales family had been killed because of real intelligence failures, but I needed Miguel to believe his information gathering hadn't been as successful as he thought. You're lying, Miguel said, but his voice lacked conviction. Check with your handlers, I suggested. Ask them how many operations have actually succeeded based on intelligence you provided. Ask them how many arrests have been made, how much money has been seized. I think you'll find that the great Miguel Santos has been feeding his organization nothing but carefully crafted disinformation. The truth was more nuanced than what I was telling him. Some of the information he'd gathered had been accurate, and some of his intelligence had probably reached cartel leadership, but I'd been careful to compartmentalize what I shared at home, feeding him a mixture of true and false details that would be difficult to verify. Stella was staring at me with a mixture of horror and amazement. Dad, you knew what he was, and you let me fall in love with him? That question cut deeper than any knife. Yes, I'd known something was wrong with Marcus, and yes, I'd been investigating him, but I'd also allowed my daughter to build a life with a man I suspected was dangerous. I'd prioritized my investigation over her emotional safety, and I'd have to live with that choice forever. I'm sorry, sweetheart, I said, my voice breaking slightly. I thought I could handle this without you getting hurt. I thought I could expose him without breaking her heart? Miguel laughed bitterly. How does it feel, Gerald? Knowing that your own investigation caused your daughter's pain? He was right, and the guilt was eating at me. But guilt was a luxury I couldn't afford right now. I had to focus on getting Stella out of this alive, and that meant continuing to undermine Miguel's confidence in his mission. Here's what's going to happen, I said, pulling out a business card and holding it where everyone could see it. I'm going to call my contact at the FBI, and you're going to release my daughter. In exchange, I'll make sure you're arrested quietly instead of being shot while resisting. The business card was real, Agent Chen's direct number, but what Miguel didn't know was that she was already on her way. The voice recording I'd mentioned wasn't just going to a server. It was being transmitted in real time to a team that had been monitoring the situation since the moment my front door was kicked in. Miguel looked at the card, then at his associates, then back at me. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, I could see fear in his eyes. His perfect revenge plot was unraveling, and he was starting to realize that he might have walked into a trap instead of setting one. But desperate men make dangerous choices, and Miguel Santos was about to prove just how dangerous a cornered predator could be. The moment I saw fear flash across Miguel's face, I knew I had him. But I also knew that cornered animals are the most dangerous, and Miguel Santos was about to prove that point in the most terrifying way possible. What he didn't realize was that I'd been preparing for this exact scenario for weeks, and every word I'd spoken since he'd revealed himself had been calculated to push him toward a very specific mistake. "You think you're so clever," Miguel said, his voice rising with desperation. "But you're forgetting something, Gerald. I still have your daughter." He was right, of course. Despite all my preparation, despite months of investigation and planning, Stella was still in mortal danger. That was the one variable I hadn't been able to control, the one piece of the puzzle that kept me awake at night. How do you protect someone who doesn't know they need protection? "Miguel," I said, keeping my voice calm and professional, "let me explain something to you about federal operations. When we know a target is planning something big, we don't just wait for it to happen. We prepare contingencies." I reached slowly into my jacket pocket, ignoring the way the Colombians tensed and raised their weapons. From inside, I pulled out a small device that looked like a garage door opener. "This is a panic button," I explained. "It's connected directly to a tactical response team that's been positioned within 3 blocks of this house for the past 2 weeks. The moment I press it, they'll be through my doors in less than 90 seconds. Miguel's eyes narrowed. "You're bluffing again." "Am I? 2 weeks ago you asked me about witness protection protocols, very specific questions about how we relocate families, how we provide new identities. That was your mistake, Miguel. No civilian knows enough to ask those kinds of questions." The truth was, I'd contacted the FBI that very night. Agent Chen had been skeptical at first. Surveillance operations on family members require significant justification and resources. But when I'd showed her the pattern of questions Miguel had been asking, the suspicious gaps in his background, and the timing of his appearance in Stella's life, she'd agreed to set up a limited monitoring operation. "The van parked across the street with the lawn care logo," I continued. "That's not a landscaping company. The jogger who's been running past my house every evening for the past week. She's Agent Martinez from the Organized Crime Task Force. The new family that moved in 3 houses down? They're actually a surveillance team." I watched Miguel's face as he processed this information. He was realizing that his 18-month operation had been compromised for weeks, that every move he'd made recently had been observed and documented. But more importantly, he was starting to understand that he'd walked into a trap. "You want to know why I didn't just have you arrested?" I asked. "Because we needed you to lead us to your handlers. We needed to see who you were reporting to, how the information was being passed along. You've been under surveillance every time you've left this house." This was partially true. The FBI had been monitoring Miguel's movements, but they hadn't identified his full network yet. However, Miguel didn't need to know that. What mattered was making him believe that his entire operation was blown. "Last Tuesday," I said, "you went to a coffee shop on 5th Street and had a 20-minute conversation with a man in a blue jacket. Yesterday, you made a phone call from the parking lot of the grocery store. We've been recording everything, Miguel. Every contact, every conversation, every move you've made." The color was draining from Miguel's face. The coffee shop meeting had been real. I'd seen it on the surveillance photos Agent Chen had showed me. But I was embellishing the details, making it sound like we knew more than we actually did. "The beautiful part," I continued, "is that you've been so focused on gathering information about me, you never noticed that I was gathering information about you. Every story you told Stella about your past, every detail about your fake life, we've been documenting it all. Building a profile, mapping your connections. Stella was staring at me with something between amazement and horror. She was beginning to understand that her entire relationship had been theater, a performance staged by both sides for very different reasons. I'd been using her boyfriend to gather intelligence, while he'd been using her to gather intelligence about me. "Dad," she whispered, "how long have you known?" "I suspected something was wrong 4 months ago," I admitted. "I confirmed it 2 months ago. I've been working with the FBI for the past 3 weeks to build a case against his entire network." The guilt in my voice was real. I'd been protecting the investigation while my daughter fell deeper in love with a man who was planning to destroy our family. I'd made the calculation that catching Miguel and his associates was worth the emotional damage to Stella, but looking at her face now, I wasn't sure I'd made the right choice. "You bastard," Miguel snarled. "You used her as bait." "No," I said firmly. "I used you as bait. Stella was never in danger as long as you needed to maintain your cover. But now that you've blown it, now that you've revealed yourself, the situation has changed." I held up the panic button again. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to release my daughter and surrender. In exchange, I'll make sure you're processed through the system instead of being shot while attempting to escape." The tall Colombian spoke for the first time in several minutes. "You think we're stupid? You think we'll just give up because you claim to have backup coming?" "I don't claim to have backup," I said. "I know I have backup, and I can prove it." I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I'd memorized weeks ago. After 2 rings, a familiar voice answered, "Agent Chen." "Sarah, this is Gerald. Execute the contingency plan." "Copy that. ETA 4 minutes." I hung up and looked at Miguel. 4 minutes until the tactical team arrives. That gives you about 3.5 minutes to make a decision that might save your life. The truth was, Agent Chen and her team had been monitoring the situation from the beginning. The conversation I just had with her wasn't about initiating a rescue operation. It was about moving to the final phase of an operation that had been in motion since the moment Miguel and his associates had kicked down my door. "You see, Miguel," I said, "the real beauty of this operation isn't that we caught you. It's that we caught you in the act of committing multiple federal crimes while working with known associates of a designated terrorist organization." Miguel's eyes widened. "What are you talking about?" "The cartel you're working for has been classified as a narco-terrorist organization since last year. That means everyone who works with them, everyone who takes their money, everyone who provides them with intelligence can be prosecuted under terrorism statutes. You're not looking at drug charges, Miguel. You're looking at terrorism charges." This was absolutely true. The designation had been classified until recently, but it changed everything about how we could prosecute cartel associates. Instead of facing 10 to 20 years for drug conspiracy, Miguel was now looking at life without parole under anti-terrorism laws. "The kidnapping charges alone will get you life," I continued. "Add in the terrorism enhancement and you'll never see daylight again. Your only chance is to cooperate fully with federal authorities." I could see Miguel calculating, trying to figure out if I was bluffing or if his situation was really as hopeless as I was making it sound. The truth was, it was worse than what I was telling him. We had 18 months of documented evidence, recorded conversations, financial transactions, and now a kidnapping with multiple witnesses. 2 minutes, I said, checking my watch. "After that, the decision gets made for you." Miguel looked at his associates, then at Stella, then back at me. I could see the exact moment when he realized that his perfect revenge plot had turned into a perfect trap, and that the only choice he had left was how he wanted to go down. But desperate men rarely make rational choices, and Miguel Santos was about to prove that the most dangerous moment in any operation is when the target realizes they have nothing left to lose. The silence in my living room stretched like a taut wire, and I could see Miguel Santos weighing his options. 2 minutes until the tactical team arrived. 2 minutes for him to decide whether to surrender or go down fighting. But what Miguel didn't know was that the FBI team wasn't coming in 2 minutes. They were already here, and had been for the past 6 minutes. The sound of breaking glass from the kitchen told me that Phase 2 of the operation was beginning. Eleanor, who had been quietly moving toward the back of the house, had just opened the sliding door for Agent Martinez, the jogger, who had been conducting surveillance for the past week. Miguel and his associates spun toward the sound, which was exactly what we'd planned. "Miguel Santos," a voice called from the kitchen. "This is the FBI. The house is surrounded. Release the hostages and surrender immediately." The tall Colombian's grip on his weapon tightened, and I could see the calculation in his eyes. 3 federal agents, unknown number of backup officers, limited escape routes. But these weren't ordinary criminals. They were cartel operatives trained for exactly this kind of situation. "Nobody moves," Miguel shouted, his composure finally cracking. He grabbed Stella roughly, pulling her against him as a human shield. "I'll kill her. I swear to God, I'll kill her." That's when I made my move. Not toward Miguel, not toward the weapons, but toward my laptop sitting on the side table. Because the final piece of this operation wasn't about tactical superiority or negotiation skills. It was about information, and I had one last card to play. "Miguel, before you do something that guarantees your death, you need to see this," I said, opening the laptop with deliberate calm. "I don't need to see anything," he snarled. But his eyes flicked toward the screen, despite himself. On the display was a video file, date stamped 3 hours earlier. The image showed Miguel entering a warehouse on the outskirts of town, but he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was Carlos Mendez, a man Miguel believed was his cartel contact, but who was actually Agent Rodriguez, a deep-cover operative who had been infiltrating the organization for 2 years. "You want to know why we let you operate for so long?" I asked. "It wasn't just to gather intelligence on you. It was to use you to reach the real targets." Miguel's face went pale as he recognized the implications. Every piece of information he'd passed to Carlos, every meeting he'd attended, every instruction he'd received, it had all been part of an FBI operation designed to map the cartel's North American network. "The warehouse meeting yesterday," I continued, "where you reported on your progress and received your final instructions for tonight, we recorded every word. More importantly, we identified every person who attended." The laptop screen switched to a new video file, this one showing a conference room where 8 men were discussing operations across multiple states. Miguel was visible in the corner, taking notes on what he believed were legitimate cartel strategies, but which were actually FBI scenarios designed to flush out other operatives. 23 arrests were made tonight, I said. Every major cartel operative on the East Coast, rounded up simultaneously while you were busy breaking into my house. Your entire network has been dismantled. This wasn't a bluff or an exaggeration. Agent Chen had confirmed the arrests during our brief phone conversation earlier. The operation had been months in the planning, with Miguel's infiltration of my family serving as just one piece of a much larger puzzle. "You're lying," Miguel said, but his voice lacked conviction. He could see the timestamp on the videos, could recognize the faces of men he'd worked with for months. "The beautiful irony," I continued, "is that you spent 18 months trying to gather intelligence to hurt me, while I was using you to gather intelligence to destroy your entire organization. Every meeting you attended, every contact you made, every piece of information you shared, it all helped us build the case that just brought down the largest cartel operation in U.S. history." Stella was staring at the laptop screen, beginning to understand the scope of what had been happening around her. Her boyfriend hadn't just been a criminal. He'd been an unwitting FBI asset, feeding information to federal agents while believing he was serving his cartel masters. "The man you've been reporting to for the past 6 months, I said, clicking to another video file. "Agent Rodriguez has been recording everything. We know about the money laundering operation in Miami, the drug shipments through New Orleans, corruption network in local law enforcement. Miguel, your organization doesn't exist anymore." The sound of tactical boots on my front porch was getting louder. The FBI team was moving into position, but they were waiting for my signal before breaching. This conversation was being recorded for evidence, and every word Miguel said was another nail in his legal coffin. "But here's the thing about terrorism charges," I continued, my voice hardening. "Under federal law, Anyone who knowingly provides material support to a designated terrorist organization can receive life imprisonment without parole. That includes kidnapping, which is what you're doing right now." Miguel's grip on Stella loosened slightly. He was beginning to understand that his situation was hopeless, that every choice he'd made over the past 18 months had been manipulated by federal agents who were always 3 steps ahead of him. "However," I said, and this was the crucial moment, "there is one way to avoid spending the rest of your life in a supermax prison." "What?" Miguel asked, and I could hear the desperation in his voice. "Full cooperation. Everything you know about cartel operations, every contact you've made, every piece of information you've gathered over the past 3 years. In exchange, we can discuss a plea agreement that might get you out of prison before you're 70. It wasn't much of an offer, but it was more than he'd have if he continued down his current path. Miguel was 28 years old, looking at the possibility of never being free again unless he chose to help destroy what remained of the organization that had sent him to destroy my family. "You want me to betray my father's people," Miguel said. "I want you to choose between spending the rest of your life in a 6x8 cell or having some chance of freedom before you die," I replied. "Your father's people are already finished. The question is whether you go down with them or help us clean up the mess." The tactical team was in position now. I could see Agent Martinez through the kitchen doorway, and I knew Agent Chen was coordinating from outside. One word from me, and they'd breach simultaneously from 3 directions. Miguel would be dead or captured within seconds, but there was always the risk that Stella could be hurt in the crossfire. 5 seconds, Miguel," I said. "Choose." That's when the lights went out. The power cut was part of the tactical plan, a way to disorient the targets and give the FBI team an advantage during the breach. But in the darkness, with my daughter still in the grip of a desperate man, those few seconds felt like an eternity. The sound of the front door exploding inward was deafening. Flashbang grenades detonated in the living room, filling the space with blinding light and overwhelming noise. Tactical teams poured through every entrance, shouting commands and securing the scene with military precision. When the tactical lights came on and the smoke cleared, Miguel Santos was face down on my living room floor with an FBI agent's knee in his back. The 2 Colombians were unconscious from the flashbangs, zip-tied and surrounded by federal agents. And Stella was sitting on my couch, alive and unharmed, wrapped in a tactical blanket and crying tears of relief and shock. "It's over," Agent Chen said, appearing beside me as EMTs checked Stella for injuries. "All targets secured, no injuries to civilians or agents." I watched as Miguel was hauled to his feet, blood running from his nose where he'd hit the floor during the takedown. He looked at me with a mixture of hatred and grudging respect, understanding finally that he'd been outplayed from the very beginning. "Gerald Martinez," he said as agents prepared to escort him out. "You destroyed my family." "No, Miguel," I replied. "Your family destroyed itself. I just made sure they couldn't destroy anyone else's." As the FBI led him away, I realized that the most satisfying moment wasn't seeing him in handcuffs. It was knowing that his elaborate plan for revenge had instead become the key to dismantling the very organization he'd been trying to serve. Justice, it turned out, had a sense of irony. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of our new house, watching Stella through the window as she tended to the small garden she'd planted in the backyard. The move had been Eleanor's idea. "Too many bad memories in the old place," she'd said. But I think the real reason was that we all needed a fresh start, a place where we could rebuild what Miguel Santos had tried to destroy. The legal proceedings had concluded 2 weeks earlier. Miguel, faced with overwhelming evidence and the complete collapse of his cartel network, had accepted a plea agreement, 25 years in federal prison, in exchange for full cooperation with ongoing investigations. It wasn't the life sentence he deserved, but it was enough to ensure he'd never hurt another family the way he'd hurt ours. The other 23 cartel operatives arrested that night had received sentences ranging from 15 years to life without parole. The organization that had taken Miguel's father had been completely dismantled, their assets seized, their operations shut down permanently. It was the kind of victory that had defined my career, but it felt different this time. More personal, more costly. Stella was seeing a therapist twice a week, working through the trauma of learning that the man she'd loved had been using her as a weapon against her own family. Dr. Sarah Williams specialized in cases involving psychological manipulation and intimate betrayal. Progress was slow, but Stella was stronger than she knew. She'd inherited that from her mother. "How is she doing today?" Eleanor asked, joining me at the window with 2 cups of coffee. "Better," I said, accepting the mug gratefully. "She's been reading again. That's a good sign." For months after the arrest, Stella hadn't been able to concentrate on anything for more than a few minutes. The revelation that 18 months of her life had been an elaborate lie had shaken her faith in her own judgment. How do you trust your instincts when they've been so thoroughly manipulated? "She asked me something yesterday," Eleanor said, settling into the chair beside me. "She wanted to know if we blamed her for what happened." I felt my chest tighten. That question had been hanging over our family like a shadow. Stella hadn't chosen to fall in love with a cartel operative, but her relationship with Miguel had been the vehicle for his attack on our family. How do you separate the victim from the weapon, especially when they're the same person? What did you tell her? The truth, that we blame ourselves for not protecting her better. Eleanor was right, but the guilt was more complicated than that. I'd known something was wrong with Marcus Romano for months before I'd acted on it. I'd prioritized building a legal case over protecting my daughter's emotional well-being. Every day she'd spent falling deeper in love with Miguel had been another day I'd chosen the investigation over her safety. The doorbell rang, interrupting my brooding. Through the front window, I could see Agent Chen standing on our porch with a manila folder in her hand. 6 months after the operation, she still checked in regularly, partly for professional reasons and partly because she'd become genuinely invested in our family's recovery. "Gerald, Eleanor," she said as I opened the door, "I hope I'm not intruding." "Never," Eleanor replied. "Come in. Coffee?" "Actually, I can't stay long. I just wanted to give you this in person." She handed me the folder, and I could see from her expression that it contained significant news. Inside were photographs, legal documents, and what appeared to be a transcript of a recorded conversation. "Miguel Santos died in federal prison 3 days ago," Agent Chen said quietly. I felt the coffee mug slip from my fingers, but Eleanor caught it before it could hit the floor. Miguel was supposed to serve 25 years. He was supposed to live with the consequences of his choices for decades. "How?" I asked. "Officially, it was a heart attack. Unofficially, the cartel has a long reach, even into federal facilities. They don't forgive betrayal, and Miguel's cooperation with us made him a target." I flipped through the documents, seeing medical reports and incident summaries. Miguel Santos, the man who'd spent 18 months planning to destroy my family, had been killed by the very organization he'd tried to serve. "There's something else," Agent Chen continued. "Before he died, Miguel asked to speak with me. He wanted to record a message." She pulled out a small digital recorder and set it on our kitchen table. "He specifically asked that this be given to your family." Eleanor and I exchanged glances. Did we really want to hear Miguel's final words? Did we need that kind of closure, or would it just reopen wounds that were finally beginning to heal? "Play it," I said finally. Agent Chen pressed the button, and Miguel's voice filled our kitchen, weaker than I remembered, but still carrying that hint of accent he'd worked so hard to hide during his time with Stella. "Gerald Martinez, if you're hearing this, it means I'm dead, and Agent Chen kept her promise to deliver this message. I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't deserve it. But there are things you need to know." There was a pause, the sound of labored breathing. "Everything I told you about my father was true. Carlos Santos was a criminal, but he was also my hero. When you sent him to prison, you destroyed the only family I had. I spent 3 years planning my revenge, and I thought I was smart enough to hurt you the way you hurt me." Another pause, longer this time. "But I was wrong about everything. Wrong about my father. Wrong about the cartel. Wrong about what justice means. In prison, I learned that Carlos Santos wasn't the man I thought he was. He'd been planning to testify against the cartel before he died. He was going to cooperate with federal prosecutors to try to reduce his sentence and get out in time to save me from the life he'd chosen. My hands tightened around the recorder. This was information that had never come out during the original trial. Your prosecution didn't destroy a loyal cartel soldier. It destroyed a man who was trying to change, trying to protect his son from following the same path. And I was too young and too angry to understand the difference. The recording crackled with static, and I could hear voices in the background. Prison sounds, the noise of a facility where dangerous men served their time. Stella didn't deserve what I did to her. She loved me completely, and I used that love as a weapon against people who only wanted to protect her. She's innocent in all of this, and if she's listening, I need her to know that her feelings were real, even if mine weren't. She deserves someone who will love her the way she deserves to be loved. I looked toward the window, where Stella was still working in the garden, unaware that the man who'd betrayed her was speaking to us from beyond the grave. Gerald, you won. Not just the case, not just the operation, but the bigger fight. You spent your career putting criminals in prison, and you were right to do it. My father died because he chose a criminal life, not because you prosecuted him for it. I chose the same path, and now I'm paying the same price. The recording was nearly over, but Miguel had one final message. I hope your family heals. I hope Stella finds happiness with someone who deserves her. And I hope you know that in the end, you saved more lives than you destroyed. My father would have understood that if he'd lived long enough to see who his son became. The recorder clicked off, leaving our kitchen in silence. Eleanor was crying quietly, and I felt something in my chest that I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction or vindication, but a profound sadness for a young man who had spent his life seeking the wrong kind of justice. He left something else, Agent Chen said, pulling a small envelope from the folder. A letter addressed to Stella. We've analyzed it for security threats. It's safe to give to her if you think she's ready. I took the letter, feeling its weight in my hands. Should I give this to my daughter? Would it help her heal, or would it cause more pain? That afternoon, I found Stella in the garden, her hands dirty from planting new flowers. She looked up as I approached, and I could see that she was having one of her better days, alert, present, engaged with the world around her. Miguel is dead, I said simply. There was no gentle way to deliver that kind of news. Stella's face went through a complex series of emotions: shock, sadness, relief, and something else I couldn't identify. She sat back on her heels, processing what I'd told her. "How do I feel about that?" she asked quietly. "However you feel is exactly right," I replied. "There's no wrong way to react to this." I handed her the letter. "He left this for you. You don't have to read it now or ever, if you don't want to." Stella turned the envelope over in her hands, studying her name written in Miguel's careful handwriting. Finally, she tore it open and read the contents silently. I couldn't see her face, but I watched her shoulders relax slightly as she reached the end. "He apologized," she said finally. "He said he knew I would never forgive him, and he didn't expect me to. But he wanted me to know that I hadn't been wrong to love him. That the person I fell in love with was real, even if everything else was a lie." She folded the letter carefully and put it in her pocket. I think I needed to hear that. That evening, our family sat together on the porch of our new house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Eleanor was reading a novel, Stella was sketching in the art pad she'd recently started carrying again, and I was just enjoying the peace of an ordinary moment. 6 months ago, I'd thought justice meant putting criminals in prison and protecting innocent people from those who would hurt them. I'd spent 32 years believing that the law was a clean line between right and wrong, good and evil. But Miguel Santos had taught me that justice is more complicated than that, more personal, more costly. The price of truth, I'd learned, isn't just paid by the guilty. It's paid by everyone who gets caught in the crossfire of other people's choices. Stella had paid that price for loving someone who was using her. Eleanor had paid it for trusting me to protect our family. I'd paid it for choosing my investigation over my daughter's emotional safety. But perhaps the highest price had been paid by Miguel himself, a young man who'd spent his life seeking the wrong kind of justice and died before he could learn what the right kind looked like. As the stars came out over our new home, I realized that this was what redemption looked like. Not a dramatic moment of vindication, but a quiet evening with family. The simple peace of knowing that we'd survived something terrible and chosen to rebuild rather than retreat. The war against the cartels would continue with new prosecutors and new agents, but for Gerald Martinez, this battle was over. And for the first time in 32 years, that was enough.